Hey guys, tonight we're heading somewhere quiet. The kind of place where the air smells like pine. The only sound is a woodpecker being slightly too enthusiastic. And there's a tiny log cabin that's seen more winters than most of us have birthdays. So, dim the lights, pull up your blanket, and let us talk about the people who somehow made those cabins comfortable, even when the weather decided to personally attack them. Because long before central heating or air conditioning, there were mountain men, trappers, and settlers who built homes in the middle of nowhere. And while most of us would have frozen or cooked alive, these guys figured out something that sounds almost too simple, a building trick that kept their cabins warm in winter, cool in summer, and perfectly livable year-round. And yes, it started with a guy who wasn't even an architect. He was just some half-starved mechanic of the wilderness, living off coffee, jerky, and spite. Let's set the scene. It's the early 1800s, the golden age of people doing deeply uncomfortable things in the name of adventure. The American frontier stretched endlessly west, and mountain men roamed it like bearded ghosts. These were the fur trappers, explorers, and semi-feral entrepreneurs who thought, sure, I'll just live alone at 10,000 feet with a flintlock rifle and see what happens. They wore animal skins, smelled like campfire, and often named their rifles things like Old Betsy or Peacemaker, which tells you a lot about their relationship status. Most of them had no real homes. A cabin, when they built one, was a survival machine, not a cozy Airbnb with rustic decor. Every log, every layer of mud, had a purpose. And yet, when archaeologists and historians later studied these old frontier cabins, they noticed something strange. Many of them were astonishingly well insulated and naturally ventilated. Even in sweltering summers, the inside stayed cool. And in brutal winters, the kind that froze rivers solid, they held warmth better than some 19th century houses in town. So how did these half-wild men pull that off? The answer lies in what one trapper supposedly called the secret of the mountain wind. Now, no one knows exactly which man came up with it. There is no single name carved in a log somewhere, but the technique spread quietly across frontier settlements. It was simple, clever, and made from nothing more than the landscape itself. Here's the trick. They built their cabins to breathe, not in the mystical sense, no incense or chanting, just smart, practical airflow. See, most early settlers who came from Europe built cabins like they built back home, tight, square, and sealed up like a coffin, which sounds great in winter until summer turns your cabin into an oven. Mountain men figured out that if you left very small gaps, tiny breathing cracks between certain logs near the roofline or vents under the eaves, the air could circulate naturally. Warm air rose up and escaped through those gaps, pulling cool air in from the shaded side of the cabin, usually through the floor or small lower vents. It was early natural convection, centuries before we started pretending we invented eco-ventilation. Of course, the trick only worked if the rest of the cabin was built right. And mountain men were surprisingly methodical about that. They knew which wood to use because not all logs are created equal. Pine was the favorite in colder regions. It was soft, easy to work with, and held warmth. Aspen or fir, on the other hand, were lighter, better for higher elevations where the sun could cook the walls by afternoon. They also understood something modern builders call thermal mass, though they'd never used that term. The thicker the logs, the more stable the inside temperature stayed. A fat pine log absorbed heat during the day and slowly released it through the night, kind of like a primitive thermal battery. So even if the outside swung from 90 degrees Fahrenheit to 40 degrees Fahrenheit, inside the cabin the shift felt smoother, like nature had been turned down to medium. And then there was placement. Oh, they obsessed over placement. You didn't just drop a cabin anywhere. You scouted the slope, checked where the morning sun hit, watched the wind patterns for a few days. If you were smart, you built your door facing east to catch light early and placed your chimney on the north side to deflect wind. You also looked for natural cover, a rise, a cluster of pines, or even a big rock wall behind the cabin, anything to act as a windbreak, because in the mountains, the wind wasn't just weather, it was a personality, and it didn't like you. Now, our so-called secret trick wasn't just about airflow. It also involved what the mountain men used between the logs, chinking. Chinking is that filler material stuffed into gaps between logs. Settlers in the east used mortar, clay, or straw. Mountain men had to get creative. They used a mixture of moss, mud, animal hair, and sometimes, I wish I was joking, bear grease. When it was packed right, the mix formed a flexible seal that expanded and contracted with the logs as the seasons changed. That meant fewer drafts in winter and less heat buildup in summer. The real genius was how they layered it. They didn't just smear mud into every gap. They left a few deliberate spaces near the top or in corners, those same breathing gaps that let air circulate. It wasn't random sloppiness. It was design disguised as laziness. Let's imagine one of these men. We'll call him Jedediah, because every mountain man's name sounded like something out of a campfire Bible story. Jedediah spent 8 months a year chasing beaver pelts in high-altitude snowdrifts. When he finally built a cabin for winter, he wasn't trying to impress anyone. He just wanted to not die. He chopped logs with a dull axe, stacked them with quiet precision, and used every ounce of instinct learned from years of freezing his hands off. When he lit his small fireplace, something miraculous happened. The draft pulled air in perfectly, the smoke rose and vanished, the warmth spread evenly, and there were no cold corners. Outside, it was 20 below. Inside, Jedediah was shirtless, sipping coffee made from roasted chicory, feeling almost smug. He didn't know the words thermodynamics or ventilation system. He just knew his cabin breathed good. What's fascinating is how modern researchers later rediscovered this same principle, sometimes by accident. In the 20th century, as log cabins became nostalgic vacation homes, builders tried sealing everything with concrete chinking or synthetic foam to modernize them. The result: condensation, mold, and heat buildup. Turns out the old-timers were right. Airtight isn't always smart. A little airflow makes a home healthier. Frontier builders had already figured that out 150 years earlier without a single engineering degree. Another part of the mountain man's secret came from how they used the earth itself. If you dig slightly into the ground, even just a couple of feet, the temperature stays surprisingly stable. So some cabins were half dugouts, partially sunk into hillsides or mounded with soil around the base. This acted like natural insulation. The earth kept the lower walls cool in summer and blocked cold drafts in winter. Add a sod roof, layers of grass and dirt on top of logs, and you basically had a natural climate control system built from whatever you could steal from the landscape. It wasn't fancy, but it worked frighteningly well. Modern experiments with reconstructed cabins show that these earth-insulated breathing structures could maintain indoor temperatures P-20 degrees Fahrenheit, more stable than the outside air with no fuel except a small fire. Not bad for guys who thought a blueprint was just the color your hands turned in January. Let's float over to another small but brilliant detail: the hearth. The fireplace wasn't just for warmth. It was the heart of the cabin's airflow system. Mountain men noticed that when a fire burned steadily, it created a natural draft, sucking in cooler air from the floor or door gaps and venting smoke and hot air upward. By placing small vents or loose chinking opposite the fireplace, they turned the entire cabin into a passive heating and cooling loop. When summer came and fires weren't needed, the same airflow pattern still worked in reverse, pulling heat out through the chimney and keeping air moving gently. That's right, the chimney wasn't just a smoke exit. It was basically a 19th century exhaust fan. Of course, not every cabin worked perfectly. Some smoked like chimneys, others leaked air like sieves, and a few probably collapsed under snow because someone got ambitious with green wood. But the ones that stood the test of time, the ones we still find traces of today in the Rockies or the Appalachians, almost always share the same features: thick logs, natural ventilation gaps, earth sheltering, and that mysterious sense of comfort you can't quite explain. It wasn't luck, it was physics disguised as folklore. So, when we talk about the secret cabin trick, it wasn't really one secret. It was dozens of small practical insights stacked together like the logs themselves. You could say it was the art of listening to nature instead of fighting it. And if there's one thing mountain men knew, it was that fighting nature never worked out. You could wrestle a grizzly, sure, but you couldn't win against winter. You could only build smarter, sit by the fire, and let the wind do half your work. Still awake, or at least half awake. Perfect. Let us drift a little further into the frontier where that same secret cabin trick started quietly spreading from one mountain valley to another. Because the thing about frontier life was that news didn't travel by newspaper or telegram. It moved through campfire stories, hunting partners, and visiting traders who spent 3 days swapping lies and bacon grease. So when one man found a better way to survive the elements, word got around slowly, like a rumor that refused to die. Before long, everyone from Tennessee to Montana was building cabins that breathed, and each region added its own twist to the design, shaped by climate, wood type, and the builder's personal level of paranoia about freezing to death. In the Appalachians, settlers took the basic mountain man layout: single-room cabin, fireplace on one end, door on the other, and made it more civilized. They started using chestnut and oak logs instead of pine. Harder to cut, but they lasted forever. And they had that deep, warm tone that made cabins look like they belonged there, as if the forest had built them for you. The Appalachian style usually had a loft, a little sleeping shelf tucked under the roof. And because heat rises, the loft stayed the warmest part of the cabin. Families slept up there in winter while keeping storage or cooking areas below. It was both practical and slightly claustrophobic, like a wooden sauna with no exits. But it worked. You'd wake up with your head full of smoke smell, your toes just above freezing, and somehow feel grateful for it. The air gaps near the rafters kept that rising heat from turning the loft into an oven, venting just enough warmth to maintain balance. It was a delicate system, not fancy, but refined through trial, error, and a lot of complaining. Meanwhile, out west, in the Rockies and the Great Basin, things got harsher. Cabins had to deal with snow measured in feet, not inches, and winds that could peel the skin off your face. So mountain men there, trappers, prospectors, and the occasional runaway went heavier. They used massive logs, sometimes nearly a foot thick, and fitted them so tightly that light couldn't pass between them. But they didn't seal everything. The smartest builders still left tiny cracks near the ridge or built vent holes with sliding wooden covers. In the dead of winter, you'd close them tight, Come spring, you'd wedge them open with a stick or a bit of antler. It sounds primitive, and it was, but it gave the cabin something modern architects now call adaptive design. And they managed it using nothing but intuition and a hatchet. Now, down south, say, in the Ozarks or along the Mississippi frontier, the problem flipped. There, the winters were short but sticky, and the summers could melt you. Cabins weren't about surviving frostbite, they were about surviving humidity. So settlers began building dog-trot cabins. If you've never seen one, imagine two small cabins sitting side by side with a covered breezeway connecting them under one big roof. That open hallway, or dog-trot, acted like a natural air conditioner. Hot air flowed upward through the open middle, creating a steady breeze between the two living spaces, one side usually for cooking, the other for sleeping. Dogs, of course, loved it, hence the name. That design might have come from mountain men, or maybe it just evolved independently, but the principle was the same. Let air move, don't trap it. People back then didn't talk about thermal comfort or air exchange rates. They just knew that when you built with nature instead of against it, your house didn't try to kill you every afternoon. Further north, in Minnesota and the Great Lakes, settlers borrowed from both Native American and Scandinavian traditions. The Scandinavians, especially Norwegians, brought their knowledge of sage-roofed cabins, layered log joinery, and earth sheltering. These cabins were almost hybrid creatures, half buried, half above ground, built to shrug off snow and hold warmth like a thermos. They'd stack birch or pine logs, then insulate the roof with layers of moss, straw, and earth. When the snow piled high, it actually added insulation, turning the roof into a living blanket. Inside, a single fireplace kept the cabin warm enough that your boots didn't freeze overnight, which, in Minnesota, counts as a luxury suite. The trick, again, came down to balance. Sealed enough to hold warmth, loose enough to let air circulate. Even the smoke found its rhythm, curling lazily up through small stone chimneys that never quite drew perfectly but just well enough to keep you from suffocating. Let's float west again, toward the Rocky Mountain trappers, the ones who truly lived at the edge of nowhere. Their cabins were usually temporary, built during the off-season when travel was impossible. They didn't have time to build perfect homes, but even quick shelters showed clever adaptation. A common technique was the partial dugout, half cabin, half hole in the ground. You'd dig into a hillside for 3 or 4 feet, use the excavated earth to build a berm around the exposed sides, and roof it with poles and sod. The result looked like a cross between a hobbit house and a bunker, but the temperature inside stayed shockingly stable. A thin fire could heat it like an oven, yet in summer it felt cool and cave-like. Some trappers even built their fireplaces slightly lower than the main floor, creating a miniature cold air pit that helped regulate airflow. If you ever wondered why early cabins often had uneven floors, that was on purpose. The low spots weren't mistakes, they were air channels. By the mid-1800s, frontier cabin design had quietly matured into an art form no one thought to write down. The pattern repeated: observation, experimentation, a few frostbitten mistakes, then a slow, unspoken consensus on what worked, and every trick, every notch, gap, vent, and slope followed one guiding principle: heat rises, air moves, and nature always wins. That's why when modern builders study these old cabins today, they still find a kind of accidental genius. You could almost call it passive intelligence. The cabins weren't smart homes, but they were homes built by smart people. Of course, the science behind it all wasn't really science back then. It was just common sense. People noticed patterns. The south-facing wall stayed warm. The shaded side stayed damp. Smoke lingered when the roof was too low, and logs cut in winter, when sap was down, didn't shrink and crack as badly. They didn't measure humidity or airflow with instruments. They just lived inside their experiments. And if something didn't work, they changed it. If a cabin smoked, they moved the chimney or raised the roof pitch. If the floor rotted, they put flat stones under the logs. If the heat kept escaping, they added a mud plaster coat or moss insulation. Each fix became part of the collective wisdom of the frontier, a wordless language of design that spread faster than any textbook could have. Now, let's not romanticize this too much. Even the best cabins still had problems. You'd wake up some mornings to find frost on the inside of your window or ice in your wash basin. Mice treated your chinking like a personal snack bar, and in summer, unless you smoked out the rafters daily, bees and wasps built rent-free apartments up there. Still, compared to canvas tents or open lean-tos, a good log cabin was paradise. And the secret trick, the breathing design, the smart airflow, made the difference between surviving and thriving. You could actually rest, cook, mend your gear, and think about things other than how much you hated the weather. That comfort mattered. It kept people sane. And maybe that's why, long after the frontier faded, the cabin remained such a powerful symbol, not of hardship, but of peace. A place that held the warmth in winter, the cool in summer, and the quiet in between. Let's drift forward a little in time to the homestead era, when thousands of settlers poured west with government land grants and dreams far larger than this. The government didn't give out instructions. You just got 160 acres and a prayer. So naturally, many of them copied the old mountain man methods, often without knowing why those methods worked. That's when you start seeing hybrid designs, cabins with sod roofs but glass windows, or log walls filled with factory-made mortars. Some of these new homes worked beautifully. Others didn't. A sealed-up cabin with no airflow turned damp and moldy. Fires smoked more, food spoiled faster. By the 1880s, rural newspapers even published short guides titled things like How to Ventilate a Frontier Dwelling. They described, often unknowingly, the same principles mountain men had figured out half a century earlier. It's kind of poetic, really. The wilderness teachers had been right all along, and the civilized world had to relearn their lessons the hard way. By the early 1900s, the era of practical log cabins was fading, but their wisdom quietly seeded modern building science. Architects studying rural cabins began writing about passive heating and cooling, natural convection, and thermal mass. They just used fancier words to describe what old trappers already knew. In a way, those cabins became the ancestors of today's green buildings. The same ideas, thick walls, natural materials, cross-ventilation, strategic shading, are all back in style now. We just pay consultants to tell us about them. Somewhere a mountain man is probably laughing in his grave. So if you ever step into an old cabin and feel that perfect balance, that strange mix of cool air and gentle warmth, the way the air smells faintly of pine and smoke, you're re-feeling the result of centuries of trial and error, a secret not passed by writing, but by living. And it all started with people who didn't see themselves as innovators. They were just cold, tired, and stubborn enough to make nature play nice, if only for one season. If you're still with me, half asleep, maybe cozy under the covers, good. We're about to drift into something older than the mountain men, older than the settlers, older than the idea of America itself. Because the truth is, the secret of keeping a cabin cool in summer and warm in winter wasn't really invented by frontier trappers. It was rediscovered. The people who already lived on this continent, long before log cabins dotted the valleys, had been building climate-smart homes for thousands of years. They didn't call it architecture, it was just life. Long before Jedediah the trapper figured out where to put his chimney, the native tribes had already mastered what the environment demanded. Each region had its own version of perfect shelter. In the Great Plains, tribes built earth lodges, dome-shaped structures made from wooden frames covered in layers of grass, sod, and clay. From the outside, they looked like gentle hills. From the inside, they stayed astonishingly steady in temperature year-round. The thick earth shell insulated them against blizzards and heat waves alike. You could sit by a small fire in January and stay warm without smoke stinging your eyes. And in August, when the prairie baked under the sun, the same lodge stayed cool like a cave that breathed. Sound familiar? It should. Because when mountain men started digging their cabins halfway into hillsides, they were copying what they'd seen in native homes. They just didn't always give credit. Further north, among the tribes of the subarctic builders used snow and sod to trap heat. The Inuit, for example, built snow houses, igloos that relied on the same principle mountain men later used with logs, thick walls, tiny air gaps, and smart airflow. Warm air from a small fire or body heat would rise and pool at the top. Cold air, being heavier, settled near a small pit by the entrance. The result, a perfectly balanced temperature comfortable enough to sleep in, even in polar night. You could say the mountain men built cabins out of trees, the same way Inuit built them out of snow. Different materials, same physics. Down in the southwest, Pueblo and Hopi peoples had another answer. Their homes were made from adobe, clay, and straw bricks dried in the desert sun. Adobe walls could be 2 feet thick, acting as a massive thermal buffer. In the heat of day, the walls absorbed warmth. At night, they slowly released it. It was the same logic the mountain men stumbled onto with thick pine logs. But here's the thing. Native builders didn't just react to their environment. They collaborated with it. Doors faced certain directions for a reason. Roof openings doubled as light wells and vents. Homes weren't just shelters, they were breathing organisms built in harmony with wind, sun, and earth. The trappers noticed this. Even if they didn't fully understand it, they paid attention. There's an old fur trader's diary from the 1830s, one of those faded journals with spelling so bad you can hear the exhaustion in it, describing a winter spent with Mandan villagers in what's now North Dakota. He wrote that their homes were warm like the inside of a bread oven, while his own log hut nearby let in more air than a sieve. He sounded both impressed and a little jealous. That winter, he noted, he copied their use of grass insulation and built a low earthen mound against his cabin's north wall. It made a wondrous difference, he said. And there it was, cultural exchange in the quietest, most practical form, stealing a good idea from someone who actually knew what they were doing. You can trace this pattern across the continent. In the Appalachians, settlers adapted native construction techniques from the Cherokee and other southeastern tribes. They learned to use bark insulation, clay plaster, and pole framing, all ideas that eventually evolved into the pioneer cabin look we think of today. In the Great Lakes, Ojibwe wigwams inspired lightweight, temporary shelters for trappers who needed mobility. The dome-like frame covered in birch bark created a dry, ventilated space that could go up in a few hours and last for weeks. Even in Alaska, Russian settlers adopted elements of native log building, especially the use of moss for insulation and small roof vents to prevent moisture buildup. In short, the mountain men's so-called secret wasn't born in isolation. It was inherited, piece by piece, from people who already understood how to live with the land. What's beautiful and a little humbling is how similar the logic was across these cultures, even when the materials changed. Whether it was birch bark, clay, snow, or pine, everyone relied on the same natural truths. Hot air rises. Thick walls hold temperature. Airflow prevents rot, and the ground itself can be your ally. None of it needed blueprints, just observation, patience, and the willingness to admit that maybe, just maybe, the earth knew what it was doing. By the mid-19th century, when settlement really exploded westward, you could see the fingerprints of native design everywhere, even if people didn't notice. Cabins in the plains had packed earth floors like earth lodges. Farmhouses in the south used clay-plastered walls like waterland orb huts. And those beloved sod houses of the Great Plains, straight-up reinventions of the same principle used by tribes for centuries. The settlers just changed the materials and called it pioneering spirit. Now, to be fair, some mountain men genuinely respected native ingenuity. They had to. They were surrounded by it. Many learned directly from native guides and adopted local building methods out of pure necessity. One mountain man, Joe Meek, famous for his ability to survive anywhere and annoy everyone, once joked that the Indians knew how to make a warm bed without a wife or whiskey. He was crude, but not wrong. He built his cabins using thick earth and chinking and grass-backed walls, a trick he admitted learning from a Shoshone family he wintered with. He said their lodge stayed as warm as the Lord's kitchen, which is about as high a compliment as a 19th-century trapper could give. Meanwhile, in more permanent frontier settlements, native influence quietly shaped how Americans thought about comfort. The old European idea of a home, a sealed upright box meant to keep nature out, didn't work well here. The climate was too extreme, too unpredictable. So the idea evolved. Instead of resisting nature, homes began to cooperate with it. By the late 1800s, even educated architects started praising vernacular wisdom, meaning, in plain English, the tricks ordinary people figured out long before anyone put a title on it. That's how native-inspired and mountain-born techniques blended into the DNA of American architecture. If you fast forward to the early 1900s, you can still see the lineage, the rise of the craftsmen in arts and crafts homes. All those cozy bungalows with deep eaves, wood beams, and airy porches borrowed heavily from the same old frontier logic. Shade the sun, vent the roof, thicken the walls. Those homes were marketed as modern and comfortable, but they were really just elegant echoes of log cabins and earth lodges. Even Frank Lloyd Wright, who reshaped American design, talked constantly about organic architecture, buildings that breathe, blend, and adapt. He didn't live in a mountain cabin, but he understood what those old builders had felt, that comfort isn't about control, it's about harmony. And maybe that's the quiet lesson hidden in all this. The mountain man's secret wasn't a single trick or a genius invention. It was a mindset, a way of saying, I'm not smarter than the weather, but I can work with it. When you think about it, that's the same philosophy behind every successful shelter humans have ever built. From igloos to yurts to cabins in the pines. It's not high-tech, it's humility in wood and mud form. So next time you see an old log cabin leaning gently into a hillside, its roof heavy with moss, its door facing east, remember that it's not just a relic of American ruggedness, it's a collaboration between cultures, climates, and centuries of quiet observation. The secret trick wasn't wire or gadgets or tools, it was listening to wind, to light, to the way warmth moves through wood, the kind of wisdom that doesn't shout, it just hums through time, the way a cabin creaks at night when the fire dies down and the air shifts. So, by now our mountain man's cabin is no longer a pile of logs in the mud, it's a real home. Smoke curls from the chimney, a faint smell of pine and stew hangs in the air, and the first frost paints lace across the window panes. But here's where the real genius starts, the part that made his cabin work like a primitive air conditioner in summer and a snug furnace in winter. The secret wasn't fancy. It wasn't even a secret, really. It was the combination of a few small ideas most people ignored because they seemed too simple. Let's start with the walls. Everyone thinks of log cabins as just logs stacked on logs, but the real trick was in how he sealed them. Early settlers called it chinking and daubing, stuffing the gaps between logs with a mix of clay, straw, moss, animal hair, or even crushed bark. Our guy, he went a step further. Instead of cramming in whatever was nearby, he layered it. Moss first, to absorb moisture, then a thin coat of clay to lock it in, and finally, a dusting of ash to keep insects out. The result was a kind of natural insulation sandwich. It let the walls breathe just enough to stop mold, but tight enough to hold warmth when needed. In summer, the same setup helped regulate humidity. The clay pulled in excess moisture and slowly released it when the air dried out. Modern people would call that passive climate control. He probably called it common sense. Now the roof most mountain men built with what they had, cedar shakes, bark or sod, but our mountain man angled his roof just right. so that during winter the low sun poured warmth inside, and during summer the high sun barely touched the windows. He didn't have a degree in thermodynamics, he just watched the sun. You'd be surprised what you notice when you spend enough time alone with your own shadow. Under the eaves, he left small openings not big enough for rain, just enough for air to drift through. These vents pulled in cool air at night and let rising hot air escape during the day. It's the same basic principle modern attics use, only his version was held together by pine sap and stubbornness. He also had a curious habit of lining parts of the interior wall with rough sawnboards, just thin planks nailed over the logs on the north side. Not for decoration. He'd slip handfuls of dried grass and animal fur between the logs and boards. Cheap insulation, but it worked. When the wind howled down from the mountains, that north wall stayed solid and warm. You might think this all sounds a bit obsessive. But remember, for him, this wasn't comfort, it was survival. A cabin that lost its heat too fast could mean frostbite by morning. A cabin that trapped too much heat in summer could drive you half mad. And if you think mad from heat sounds dramatic, you've never tried to sleep through a mountain July with no breeze and a tin stove in the corner. Another detail, and this one's easy to miss, was how he used the floor. Most log cabins had dirt floors at first, packed earth, cold, damp, and a breeding ground for misery. But he dug out a shallow layer, filled it with crushed rock, then laid thick planks of pine on top. Between the rocks and the wood, air could circulate. It kept the floor from freezing and helped cool the room when the air grew heavy. Again, nothing magical, just a man who paid attention to how heat moved. But maybe the most interesting part, the part people still talk about in mountain lore, was how his cabin seemed to breathe, even after sealing, layering, venting, and insulating. It never felt stuffy. When you walked in, the air felt alive. Dry in winter, fresh in summer. No smoke buildup, no trapped dampness. That's because of one small, clever feature, a vent hole hidden behind the stove. It drew in cool air from under the cabin and let it rise naturally toward the ceiling, circulating warmth through the space. Essentially, he'd built a crude form of convection heating decades before anyone talked about it in textbooks. You could say he stumbled into physics by accident, but the thing about accidents in history is, most of them come from someone who paid attention when others didn't. When neighbors came by, if he had any within a few miles, they'd step inside and wonder why his place always felt so comfortable. Some thought it was the wood, some thought it was luck. He'd just shrug. It's in the walls, he'd say, and it was. His cabin became something of a quiet legend among trappers and traders, not for being fancy, but for being right. A structure that worked with nature instead of fighting it. Long before words like eco-design or green architecture got tossed around, one bearded man in the wilderness had already figured out the balance. So while others rebuilt, patched leaks, or froze through February, his little home just worked. Let's float a little further into how this way of thinking spread from one mountain man's quiet ingenuity to a whole culture of frontier adaptation. Because, as it turns out, good ideas have a funny way of surviving the winter too. When spring came to the mountains, people started wandering again. Traders followed the thawing rivers, trappers came down with their pelts, and new settlers arrived with the same wide-eyed optimism that usually lasted until their first blizzard. Word traveled fast in those days, not through newspapers, but through campfire talk, whiskey, and long walks between trading posts. Somewhere in those conversations, someone mentioned a cabin that never froze and never roasted, a place that breathed. They said a mountain man up north had figured out some kind of secret. Now, no one ever wrote down exactly who that man was. There are a dozen names that show up in journals and letters from the 1820s and 1830s. Wyatt, Boone, Bridger, Carson. Every one of them lived out there, alone or nearly so, tinkering with ways to keep their lungs working through both snow and heat. The truth is, our story's mountain man could have been any of them, or all of them. The frontier was full of people who didn't invent things as much as rediscover them. That breathing cabin idea spread in pieces. A trader might notice the layered chinking and copy it. A farmer passing through might see how the vents worked and carve his own version into his barn. Before long, you could find cabins across the frontier that shared small hints of the same wisdom floors that floated above ground. Chimneys placed just so, gaps sealed with moss and clay in tidy layers. Nobody called it engineering, it was just what worked. Frontier life had a way of sanding down pride. You didn't build something to show off, you built it to not die. So when something worked, you copied it without question. If it was a trick picked up from a trapper, a native, or an old journal, it didn't matter. The wilderness didn't care who got the credit, and in the middle of that quiet exchange of ideas, the cabin became more than just shelter. It became the physical memory of adaptation. Every improvement, every clever fix, every layer of moss or ash told a story of trial and error. It's easy to imagine how those ideas drifted east again. Settlers who struck out west and failed often came crawling back, carrying with them hard-earned lessons. Some of those lessons ended up in the cabins of Appalachia, the homesteads of Minnesota, and even early Alaskan outposts. Each version slightly different, but with that same practical wisdom baked in. Don't fight the mountain, let it teach you. By the time government surveyors started mapping the territories in the mid-1800s, they found cabins that stayed remarkably stable through wild temperature swings. Reports mentioned structures that held steady even when the thermometer dropped below zero, with interiors still hovering just above freezing without a roaring fire. It was impressive if you knew what to look for. But, of course, no one wrote home saying, "Dear family, I've discovered the miracle of natural air convection." They said things like, "This cabin feels right." There's something deeply human about that, how practical knowledge gets passed on, not by theory, but by feel. You touch the wall. You notice it's warm when it should be cold. You remember, and somewhere in that unspoken transfer of skill, the mountain man's secret trick stopped being a novelty and became the foundation for a whole style of frontier craftsmanship. Even decades later, as sawmills spread and lumber got cheaper, many builders still mimicked those same patterns. They probably didn't even know why. They just knew that certain angles caught the breeze, certain materials kept the damp away, and certain walls seemed to hold warmth like an old friend. You can still see traces of it today in historic cabins preserved in parks. Look close, and you'll notice the same principles. Vents hidden under eaves, layered chinking, floor gaps for air movement. If you ever visit one in person and feel oddly comfortable inside, even without heat or AC, you'll know why. It's funny, isn't it, how the simplest tricks outlast the grand ones. The mountain man never patented anything. He never became famous. He probably never thought of himself as an innovator. But the way he stacked logs, sealed gaps, and respected the natural flow of air quietly rippled through time. And maybe that's what makes his story so quietly satisfying. It's not about heroism or invention. It's about paying attention, about listening to the land instead of trying to outsmart it. If you think about it, that's what all great survival stories boil down to. The clever ones didn't conquer nature. They learned its language. So next time you walk into an old log cabin and feel that strange calm inside, cool when it's hot outside, warm when it's snowing, you're restanding in a legacy built by people who had nothing but their hands, their instincts, and a desperate need to stay alive through one more winter. Let us drift a little further before we enter toward what happened to those men after the age of mountain survival began to fade. When the railroad, the telegraph, and industry started reshaping their world, because even when the mountains grew quieter, the lessons inside those cabins never really went away. By now, our mountain man's cabin has seen many winters and summers. The forest has crept closer, snow has piled higher than he ever expected, and the wind has tested every log and vent. And yet, it stands. Not because it's fancy, not because anyone called it genius, but because it followed the quiet rules of nature and the hard-earned wisdom of those who came before. The mid-19th century brought change. Railroads started carving lines through mountains and plains. Telegraph wires ran like veins across the continent. Towns sprang up where wilderness once ruled. Life became faster, denser, and a little less lonely. For many mountain men, that meant a choice. Some stayed. They kept trapping, guiding, and building. But many moved on, traded their axes for saws and sawmills, or took jobs helping settlers adapt the old ways to new communities. And what happened to the cabins? Some were abandoned, left to sag and rot. Others became models for settlers building more permanent homes. The same tricks, the layered chinking, the subtle vents, the attention to airflow were copied, refined, and sometimes even embellished. The secret of staying comfortable in the mountains quietly migrated into early American architecture. You could see it in rural homesteads: deep eaves to block summer sun, thick log walls for winter warmth, windows oriented to catch breezes. Builders may have forgotten the original mountain man, but his lessons endured. By the late 1800s, there was even a small cottage industry around log cabin-style construction. Early guidebooks published in frontier towns gave instructions for proper ventilation, chinking, and roof pitch. The advice was practical and cautious. It rarely mentioned the mountain men themselves. It didn't need to. Their influence was already built into the walls, and the cabins were still breathing. Some of the oldest preserved structures, when studied by historians and engineers, revealed airflow patterns remarkably similar to what modern HVAC designers would call passive ventilation. Warm air rose, cool air sank, moisture moved out without condensation forming. A century before anyone called it sustainable design, frontier log cabins had mastered it. Even as technology advanced, the principle remained. Electric heaters and stoves could supplement the natural balance, but the cabin didn't rely on them. If you turned off the heat for a day, it didn't immediately become unbearable. That was the brilliance of its simplicity and observation, producing comfort without fuss. Life in the cabins also revealed an unintended social benefit. Families or small groups living in these carefully constructed spaces spent more time together around the fireplace or loft. The cabin naturally encouraged warmth and community. Even when outside it was bitter and silent, the design had a rhythm that mirrored life itself, practical, steady, and slow. Mountain men themselves remained quiet about their methods. They rarely wrote down their techniques. Their knowledge passed mostly by imitation. A new neighbor might notice a vent under the eaves, or the way the roof sloped, and quietly adopt it. Over decades, these small details became part of the vernacular, part of the collective understanding of how to live with the seasons rather than against them. As the frontier faded further, the secret trick became folklore. Campfire stories credited mysterious inventors or clever animals. Local legends told of men who could make the cabin warm without fire, or cool without shade, though most listeners just assumed it was exaggeration. Yet, if you visited one of these cabins today, you can still feel the effect. Walk inside during a hot summer afternoon, and the air feels steady. Step in on a snowy winter night, and the warmth lingers just right. Nothing is perfect, nothing is mechanical. It's quiet, subtle, and almost invisible. And that's exactly how the mountain man wanted it. He didn't need recognition. He didn't need a patent, he needed survival. Comfort was a bonus. His real skill lay in observing nature, experimenting, and adjusting, season after season, until the cabin worked without constant intervention. Even when settlers and architects came along, fascinated by these rustic structures, they sometimes misunderstood them. Some replaced chinking with concrete, covered vent holes, or sealed everything airtight. The cabins lost the subtle balance that made them special. But those who studied surviving structures realized that the original method, simple logs, moss and clay layers, thoughtful orientation, and tiny breathing gaps, was remarkably resilient. A building that worked with nature could outlast those that fought it. And so the legacy of that mountain man endured not in fame, not in plaques or statues, but in the quiet, enduring comfort of a well-built log cabin. As you imagine this, picture the stillness of a winter night. Snow outside, fire smoldering inside. A cabin perfectly balanced with the seasons. That balance is the mountain man's gift. It's subtle, easy to overlook, and nearly forgotten, but it's there in every log and every vent, waiting for anyone willing to notice. That's the quiet miracle of frontier design. It doesn't shout, it doesn't dazzle, it simply works. And that's why, even as technology marched on, the principles behind his secret trick remain relevant. Thick walls, careful orientation, mindful airflow, and respect for the seasons. The mountain man didn't need to know thermodynamics, engineering, or architecture. He needed intuition, patience, and a willingness to pay attention. And by doing that, he built something that survived the harshest winters, the hottest summers, and the long, lonely years in between. And with that, we leave the mountain man's cabin for now, standing quietly in the wilderness, weathering storms, welcoming wind, holding warmth. A monument not of grandeur but of practical wisdom, a testament to living with nature instead of struggling against it. If you've been drifting along so far, you might already feel the rhythm, the quiet, the steady hum of cabins, logs, and the mountain man's secret wisdom. Now let's move into a slightly later time, when the frontier had begun to vanish, and the idea of the cabin transformed from necessity into something almost ceremonial. By the early 20th century, the wilderness that had shaped mountain men was no longer empty. Railroads, roads, and towns carved pathways through forests and valleys. And with that, a new kind of visitor arrived. People who didn't need to survive the elements, they wanted to experience them. National parks were forming. Yellowstone, Yosemite, Glacier, and those park designers faced a challenge: how to accommodate visitors without erasing the wild, rugged feel of the landscape. Enter the log cabin, or more accurately, the mountain-inspired lodge. Architects and park planners borrowed heavily from frontier cabins, not just their look but their underlying principles. Thick logs, angled roofs, vented spaces, and low earthy lines that harmonized with nature. The National Park Service even formalized what became known as rustic architecture. The goal wasn't modern convenience, it was subtlety. Cabins and lodges had to blend with the landscape while remaining comfortable. They had to keep guests warm in winter, cool in summer, and safe from rain without any mechanical systems. In other words, the mountain man's centuries-old tricks became a blueprint for an entire architectural movement. These lodges often had double-pitched roofs, wide eaves, and stone chimneys. They incorporated porches and overhangs that created natural ventilation. Windows were oriented for prevailing winds. Inside, floors and walls were layered in ways that echoed the layered chinking of frontier cabins. Visitors may have thought of it as quaint or charming, but anyone paying attention would notice the same principle that kept a trapper comfortable in 1825. Let the building breathe. At the same time, log cabins began appearing in vacation culture. Wealthy families built summer homes in the mountains, often calling them cabins even when they were luxurious. They copied frontier aesthetics: rough-hewn logs, mossy roofs, low ceilings but subtly. The ventilation and insulation principles persisted. In some ways, the mountain man's secret trick went mainstream. People marveled at how cozy these structures felt, especially in extreme temperatures, without understanding why. Thick walls, small vents, airflow management, what had been born from necessity was now appreciated as style and comfort. Interestingly, this revival also intersected with a growing awareness of natural efficiency. Architects began studying these buildings systematically. They measured airflow, thermal mass, and insulation performance. They realized that the old cabins weren't just charming, they were effective. Some of the early 20th century park lodges explicitly credited traditional log cabin techniques in their construction notes. They mentioned layered chinking, strategic venting, and roof angles adapted for sunlight and wind. Those notes show an acknowledgement of something most people had ignored for a century. Practical observation beats theory when it comes to surviving nature. Meanwhile, the cabins themselves became symbols. The mountain man's original ideas, so humble, so unassuming, were now represented as a kind of cultural ideal. They embodied simplicity, resilience, and harmony with the environment. People romanticized them, writing books and articles praising frontier ingenuity. And yet, the real genius was subtle. It wasn't about fancy timberwork or grand design. It was the quiet attention to detail, how air moved, how walls held heat, how roofs shaded interiors. These were solutions evolved from decades of trial, error, and observation. By the 1920s and 1930s, the log cabin was everywhere in popular imagination. Camps, lodges, vacation homes, and even public buildings adopted elements of frontier design. The emphasis was on experienced rustic charm, connection to nature, and the illusion of simplicity. Behind the scenes, however, the principles of thermal balance, airflow, and insulation remained intact. Visitors enjoyed natural comfort without realizing they were benefiting from techniques honed by trappers, native peoples, and mountain men over a century earlier. And so, in a quiet way, the mountain man's influence had extended far beyond the valleys and forests. From lonely trapper cabins to grand national park lodges, from the simplest winter shelter to cultural icons of rustic living, his secret persisted. It was a legacy not written in books or patents, but in air and wood. A principle so subtle, so seamless, that most people never noticed it, yet anyone stepping inside a well-built cabin could feel it. The walls that hold warmth, the venting that keeps air moving, the harmony with the natural world. In other words, the mountain man's wisdom had outlived him. The cabins didn't just survive, they taught. They taught anyone who entered how to live with the seasons, not against them. And as night falls over these lodges and cabins, imagine the soft creak of logs settling, the gentle sigh of wind through the eaves, and the warmth radiating steadily from a fire that doesn't need to roar. That's the gift he left behind: quiet comfort, invisible engineering, and a lesson in listening to nature. By now, our journey has traveled from remote mountain valleys, to frontier cabins, to the lodges of national parks. And yet, the story doesn't end there. The principles that once kept trappers alive quietly filtered into modern architecture, subtly shaping how we build and inhabit spaces even today. You might think of log cabins as nostalgic relics, picturesque, romantic, rustic, but they are also early examples of passive design. Builders long before electricity or HVAC systems instinctively understood airflow, insulation, and thermal mass. They didn't need engineers or blueprints. They needed observation, patience, and a willingness to live through both winter and summer extremes. In the mid-20th century, architects studying vernacular buildings noticed that these old cabins often outperformed many modern homes of the time in natural ventilation and temperature regulation. Thick walls, low ceilings, and vented roofs created environments that were both comfortable and energy. Some even noted that summer heat rarely penetrated more than a few feet into the cabin, and winter chill stayed at the edges. Modern builders started borrowing these lessons, though rarely in the same handcrafted way. Passive solar design, cross-ventilation, and thermal mass are all concepts that echo the same ideas the mountain man stumbled onto. The only difference is that now, instead of moss and clay, we use insulation panels and HVAC calculations. But the underlying logic remains unchanged. There's also the cultural fascination. In the late 20th century, log cabins became symbols of retreat, places to escape noise, technology, and constant activity. People building them may not have been thinking about airflow or insulation. They were thinking about peace, quiet, and authenticity. And yet, thanks to centuries of refinement, the same cabins that now serve as weekend retreats naturally manage temperature and humidity. The walls breathe, the roof vents subtly, and the floors buffer cold or heat. The secret trick of the mountain man survives, invisibly guiding modern comfort. Even tiny details like window orientation or roof overhang, lessons learned over generations. In many modern cabins, designers still place windows to catch prevailing winds or let low winter sun inside while blocking summer rays. Roofs angle to shed rain and snow efficiently, and thick logs or composite walls maintain a stable interior temperature. The lineage is almost poetic. What started as necessity, learned from observation and borrowed from indigenous knowledge, has traveled across centuries. Now, it influences both practical construction and the romantic imagination of Americans and people around the world. And perhaps that's the most remarkable thing. A man surviving alone in the wilderness, cutting logs, and packing moss, never imagined that his simple, quiet techniques would echo into modern times. There's no patent, no fame, no accolades, just a legacy embedded in walls, roofs, and floorboards. Every cabin you visit today that feels just right, not too hot, not too cold, carries traces of that wisdom. It's a subtle lesson in harmony, observation, and patience. In a world that often prizes innovation as something flashy, the mountain man reminds us that sometimes the simplest and quietest solutions endure the longest. So as we drift toward the close of this tale, picture the scene: a winter sunset casting long shadows over a rustic cabin, smoke curling gently from the chimney, the interior balanced perfectly between warmth and coolness, humans and nature coexisting in a quiet equilibrium. That's the mountain man's legacy. And it is, perhaps, the ultimate reminder that comfort, wisdom, and ingenuity don't always announce themselves loudly. Often, they simply work. By this point, we've explored the mountain man's secret, the evolution of the cabin, and how those simple principles traveled from wilderness survival to national parks and modern design. But let us pause for a moment and think about the people who actually lived inside these spaces. Because a cabin is more than walls and a roof. It's a home, a shelter, and sometimes a sanctuary. Inside the frontier cabin, life moved slowly. Every action had purpose: stacking firewood, repairing the roof, or adjusting vents. Meals were simple, often whatever could be trapped, foraged, or stored. Yet, in that simplicity, there was rhythm. The cabin itself enforced it. The temperature was rarely harsh, the airflow rarely stagnant. It created an environment where humans could focus, rest, and endure. Families who settled in these cabins learned subtle lessons about comfort, patience, and observation. Children grew up noticing how sunlight shifted across the floor, how drafts snuck in around doors, and how moss or clay kept the cold at bay. These lessons weren't taught explicitly. They were absorbed, quietly shaping their understanding of nature and survival. Even social life adapted to the structure. With low ceilings, thick walls, and central hearths, cabins encouraged closeness. Families sat near fires, told stories, cooked meals, and repaired tools together. The cabin became a microcosm of frontier life, warm, intimate, and balanced. For the mountain men themselves, these structures were both physical and emotional refuges. After weeks or months in the forest, tracking game, repairing traps, and enduring storms, stepping inside a well-built cabin was like returning to a steady heartbeat. The walls, vents, and insulation didn't just provide warmth, they offered predictability and security. Even in harsh winters, these cabins could feel surprisingly gentle. A small fire in the corner, a vent drawing in fresh air, and the thick walls holding heat created a quiet kind of comfort that modern homes sometimes lack. There were no thermostats, no machines humming, no sudden bursts of cold, just a balance achieved through design, observation, and centuries of refinement. Over time, cabins became a canvas for memory. Every mark on the wall, every repaired gap, every layer of insulation told a story of survival, care, and attention. They were living structures, responding subtly to the people inside and the environment outside. And perhaps this is the most human aspect of the mountain man's legacy. The secret trick wasn't just about airflow or insulation. It was about creating a space where humans could exist in harmony with nature. It was about quiet safety, about observing, adapting, and finding comfort without relying on technology. Even today, people retreat to cabins not just for nostalgia but for that emotional resonance. They seek the calm, the slow pace, the gentle balance between shelter and nature. And in doing so, they are continuing the lineage of observation, patience, and harmony, begun by mountain men and inspired by the native builders who came long before. So, as the night deepens, imagine yourself in one of these cabins. Outside, snow or wind might press against the walls. Inside, it's calm, the air circulates gently, the fire radiates warmth without fury, and everything feels balanced. This is the quiet genius of frontier life. Not heroic, not flashy, not recorded in textbooks, but enduring, subtle, perfectly effective. The mountain man's secret lives are not just in logs, moss, and clay, but in the rhythm of life itself, in every thoughtful home that listens to the seasons and breathes with the world around it. By now we've wandered through wilderness valleys, traced the evolution of cabins from the frontier to national parks, and glimpsed how the simple wisdom of one mountain man quietly shaped generations of shelter. It's time to pause and reflect on why this matters not just historically, but for us today. The first thing to notice is humility. The mountain man's secret wasn't born of genius in a laboratory or a sudden invention. It came from observation, patience, and learning from others' native peoples, fellow trappers, and nature itself. He didn't control the weather, he adapted to it, and in doing so, he built something enduring. That's a lesson we often forget in modern life. We chase clever solutions, gadgets, and flashy innovations, sometimes overlooking simple truths: watch, listen, adjust. The mountain man's cabin reminds us that effective design isn't always obvious or loud. Sometimes it's subtle, quiet, and nearly invisible. The second lesson is harmony. His cabins didn't fight nature. They worked with it. Thick walls, layered insulation, clever ventilation, these features weren't arbitrary. Each decision reflected an understanding of climate, seasons, and airflow. The cabin became a partner, not a battleground. Modern architecture still draws on this principle. Passive heating and cooling, energy-efficient design, and sustainable building materials are just contemporary ways of practicing the same respect for nature that trappers and native builders demonstrated centuries ago. Even outside construction, the principle applies. Observe first, adjust second. Don't try to conquer forces you don't fully understand. Let your environment guide your choices. Finally, there's the human element. The cabin wasn't just a physical structure, it shaped life inside. Families learned rhythm, children absorbed practical knowledge, and adults found comfort and security. The design fostered intimacy, patience, and a slow, reflective pace. Today, when people retreat to cabins or rustic lodges, they're seeking more than aesthetics, they're seeking that balance. They're craving a place where the world slows down, where space and shelter feel aligned with natural rhythms. That's the quiet inheritance of the mountain man's careful observations. So, as you imagine the end of this story, picture the scene one last time: snow settling outside, the soft creak of logs as they adjust to cold and heat, smoke drifting lazily from a chimney, and air circulating perfectly through a home built centuries ago from simple logs, clay, moss, and intuition. The mountain man's legacy isn't in fame, books, or inventions. It's in walls that breathe, roofs that shelter, floors that balance temperature, and in the quiet lessons that endure every time someone enters a well-built cabin and feels immediately at home. It's a reminder that wisdom doesn't have to shout. Sometimes it whispers through the trees, the logs, and the spaces in between. And with that, we leave the mountains, the cabins, and the quiet genius of one man who simply paid attention. The secret trick may have been simple, but its impact resonates across centuries, shaping the way humans live, rest, and find comfort in harmony with the world around them. Sleep well, and maybe tomorrow, notice the quiet balance in the spaces around you.